The courtroom was silent. At the center of it all sat a little girl, barely 12 years old, Sophie. Her feet didn't quite touch the floor, and the oversized witness chair made her look even smaller. But there was nothing small about what she was about to say. Across the courtroom, her father, Mark, sat at the defense table, his wrists cuffed, his eyes hollowed from sleepless nights. A man accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit. In the audience, her mother, Lisa, clutched a tissue in trembling hands. Tears lined her tired face, but she didn't dare blink. Friends, before I share today's episode, I want to tell you an interesting stat. 99% of the people who watch our content enjoy it, but they haven't subscribed to our channel yet. If you're one of those 99%, all you need to do is a small task. Just look below this video, you'll see a subscribe button. All you have to do is click that subscribe button. It's as simple as that. And if you want, you can also press the bell icon so that you're the first to know whenever we upload a new video. Now, let's dive into the video. Everyone was waiting, watching. The defense lawyer stepped forward, his voice steady but careful. "Sophie, do you understand that telling a lie in court is a crime?" The words hung in the air. Sophie swallowed hard. She could feel the weight of every gaze pressing against her. The judge, the jury, the prosecutor, waiting to tear her apart. Her fingers clenched around the worn, stuffed bunny in her lap, the one she had held through endless nights when her father wasn't there to tuck her in. Then she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." The lawyer hesitated, watching her. "Then let me ask you again, Sophie." His voice was calm but firm. "Did your father hurt Mr. Jennings?" The room shrunk. The walls felt closer, the air thinner. Sophie could hear everything. The quiet shuffle of papers, the creak of the judge's chair, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Slowly, she looked up. At her mother, who could barely breathe. At her father, who looked at her like she was his only hope left in the world. At the rows of strangers, judging her with their eyes. Sophie's small hands tightened into fists. Then she spoke. "Number." The words sliced through the silence. For a moment, no one reacted. Then gasps. Lisa covered her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. Mark snapped his head up, his tired eyes wide, as if someone had just pulled him from the depths of the ocean. The prosecutor shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor." The judge slammed the gavel. Order in the court. The room was shifting. The energy, electric. The defense lawyer leaned in. "Sophie, are you saying your father is innocent?" Another pause that stretched too long. The jury leaned forward. Sophie hesitated. For the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. But then, something changed. She sat up straighter, tightened her grip on the microphone. And then, she said the words that shattered everything. "He didn't do it." The courtroom rippled with whispers. But Sophie wasn't finished. She lifted her chin, looked straight at the judge, and said, "But I know who did." The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, papers shuffled, chairs scraped against the floor. Lisa broke down in sobs. The prosecutor's face froze, caught between shock and disbelief. Mark leaned forward, his chained hands trembling slightly. The judge banged the gavel again. "Order! Order in the court!" The chaos swirled around Sophie, but she didn't flinch. She sat there, a 12-year-old girl holding a truth that no one saw coming. And in that moment, the world had no choice but to listen. Stay with us till the end, because what Sophie does next will shock everyone. The sun is warm. The sound of children playing drifts through the suburban street. A lawn sprinkler spins lazily, throwing shimmering droplets into the air. A small house sits at the end of the block, modest, but filled with life. Inside, laughter echoes. Sophie sits on the living room floor, a colored pencil in her hand, her notebook open. Her tiny fingers trace careful lines, bringing a sketch to life. Beside her, Mark, her father, holds up a wrench like it's a magic wand. "Prepare to be amazed," he says, a playful smirk on his face. Sophie glances up, raising an eyebrow. "It's just a toaster, Dad." Thank you. I'll be here all week." Lisa chuckles, rolling her eyes. This is what home feels like. Warm, safe, untouched by the world outside. But that was before. Before the sirens, before the flashing lights, Before everything changed, late that night, Sophie sleeps soundly, tucked beneath her blankets. A stuffed bunny rests beside her. The house is quiet. Then, a distant noise. At first, it barely registers, but then it grows. Sirens. Flashing red and blue lights dance across Sophie's bedroom wall. Her eyes flutter open. Confusion fogs her mind as she pushes herself up, blinking against the eerie glow. A shout cuts through the night. "Step out with your hands up." Sophie's blood runs cold. She throws off her blanket, her small feet hitting the wooden floor as she stumbles toward her bedroom door. More voice loud, urgent. Then her mother's scream. "No, please, you're making a mistake." Sophie bolts down the hallway, her heartbeat slamming against her ribs. She reaches the top of the stairs and freezes. Her father stands in the middle of the living room, his hands raised, his face pale with shock. A dozen police officers surround him. The front door is wide open, the night spilling in like a nightmare. One officer grabs Mark's wrist. Sophie sees the cold flash of metal, the click of handcuffs. Lisa lunges forward, but an officer holds her back. "Mark, tell them you didn't." "I swear." Mark's voice cracks with desperation. "You're wrong. I didn't do this." But no one is listening. Sophie feels her breath catch. This can't be happening. She tries to move, tries to speak, but nothing comes out. Then, her father turns. His eyes meet Sophie's. For a split second, time slows. Then, "Sophie," Mark's voice is urgent, desperate. "Go back upstairs, sweetheart." But she can't. She watches helpless, frozen, as her father is dragged toward the front door. As the neighbors step outside, whispering, as the man she once thought was unbreakable is shoved into a police car, the door slams shut. The sirens wail. And just like that, he's gone. Lisa collapses to the floor, sobbing. Sophie just stands there, staring. Her mind races, spirals, shuts down. Thina, crackling voice from a police radio. Suspect's wallet recovered at the scene, confirmed fingerprints on the back door. Sophie's stomach twists. Her father's wallet? His fingerprints? Her hands shake. She wants to scream, to tell them they're wrong, that her father isn't a criminal. But no one is listening. She looks up, at her mother, at the flashing lights, at the place where her father had just been standing, and something inside her cracks. She doesn't know it yet. But this is the moment everything changes. This is the moment she realizes, if no one else will prove her father's innocence, she will. What if the person you trusted most was accused of something terrible? What would you do? The house felt different now. Gone were the warm sunlight and the echoes of laughter. The air was heavier, the silence thicker. Sophie sat on the living room couch, staring at the empty spot on the floor where her father used to sit. It had been 2 days since the arrest. Her mother barely spoke. She moved like a ghost through the house, picking up objects, setting them down, then picking them up again, as if waiting for something to wake her from the nightmare. Sophie hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flashing red and blue lights. She heard the click of handcuffs. She saw the police car door slam shut. The world outside moved on without them. The sun still shined. Neighbors still watered their lawns. Cars still drove past their house. But inside these walls, nothing was the same. And then came the whispers. At school, the stares began before she even reached her classroom. She could feel them. Eyes pressing into her. Murmurs spreading in hushed voices, not meant for her to hear but loud enough that she did. That's her. Her dad's the one who... I heard they found his wallet at the crime scene. Sophie kept her head down, gripping the straps of her backpack. Her best friend, Maddie, had always waited for her at their lockers, but today she was nowhere to be found. Sophie spotted her across the hallway standing with a group of girls, whispering. Maddie looked up. Their eyes met. For a second, Sophie thought she'd smile, wave, say something. But Maddie just looked away. Sophie's chest tightened. Her fingers curled into fists, her nails pressing into her palms. She wanted to scream, tell them they were wrong, tell them her father was innocent, but her throat felt tight, like all the words had been stolen from her. By lunchtime, she couldn't take it anymore. She found an empty table in the corner of the cafeteria and sank into the seat. She barely touched her food. A group of kids walked past, their voices just low enough to be dangerous. I heard her dad broke into that guy's house and almost killed him. Yeah, my mom said he's probably going to jail forever. Can you imagine? Her dad's a criminal. The words stung like knives. Sophie clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stare down at her tray. Don't cry, don't let them see. A shadow loomed over her table. She looked up expecting Maddie, hoping maybe she'd finally say something. But it wasn't Maddie. It was Jason Reynolds, one of the older boys in school. He smirked. Hey, Sophie, what's it like having a murderer for a dad? The whole table behind him laughed. Sophie's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood up so fast she almost knocked over her tray. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to yell, to throw her food in his face, to tell them they were all wrong. But all she did was run. Out of the cafeteria, down the hallway, out the doors. She didn't stop running until she was far away from school, far away from everything. Her breath came in short, broken gasps as she sank onto a bench at the park. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Her dad wasn't a murderer. He wasn't. So why did the world already believe he was? Sophie didn't go back to school that day. Instead, she sat on the park bench, gripping the edges of the seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. The weight of the whispers, the stares, the accusations, they pressed down on her, suffocating. She could still hear Jason's voice echoing in her head. Hey, Sophie, what's it like having a murderer for a dad? She swallowed hard, blinking back the tears threatening to spill. Number. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't break. If no one else was going to fight for her father, then she would. She just needed to find the truth. Sophie pulled out her notebook from her backpack, the same one she always carried, filled with half-finished doodles, stories, and little secrets only she knew. But now, it was going to be something else. A case file. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote in bold letters, "Who really hurt Mr. Jennings?" She underlined it twice. Her mind raced back to the night of the arrest. The flashing lights, the police officers, the crackle of the radio. Suspect's wallet recovered at the scene, confirmed fingerprints on the back door. Over. That had been the moment. The so-called proof. Sophie frowned. Something about it felt off. Her dad was always careful with his things. He never just left his wallet lying around. And why would he touch the back door? They never even used the back entrance of Mr. Jennings's house. Her gut told her what no one else would believe. Someone planted it. But who? Sophie bit the end of her pen, thinking. There was one thing she knew for sure if she wanted answers. She needed to start paying attention. Really paying attention. That night she waited until her mom fell asleep before she made her move. She crept out of bed, her heart pounding with every soft step across the creaky floor. Downstairs, the glow from the streetlights barely lit the darkened living room. She grabbed her mum's laptop from the table and curled up on the couch, typing as quietly as she could. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then she started searching. Break-ins in Glendale, recent burglaries, Glendale home invasions. At first, nothing seemed useful, just a bunch of random stories. But then something caught her eye. A small article, buried beneath the rest. Police report a string of home burglaries in the Glendale area. In multiple incidents, security cameras were damaged, and the suspect escaped without being seen. Sophie's pulse quickened. Security cameras? Damaged? She read further. No arrests have been made, but authorities believe the suspect may be responsible for multiple break-ins over the past 6 months. 6 months? Her father had never been in trouble with the law, ever. But if someone else had been breaking into houses before Mr. Jennings was attacked, maybe the police had been so desperate for an arrest that they ignored the real pattern. Sophie jotted everything down in her notebook. There was still one missing piece, and then she remembered. The day before the attack, she had been riding her bike past Mr. Jennings's house when she saw someone near his back fence. A man. He had been fiddling with something metal, something mounted to the house. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Just a worker, maybe. But now, it sent a chill up her spine. Had he been messing with the security camera? Had he been planning the break-in before it even happened? Her fingers clenched around her pen. She had seen his face. Not clearly, not enough to know who he was, but enough to know he wasn't her father. Sophie's heart pounded. She had a new name to write in her notebook. Not her dad's. Not yet a suspect's, but one that mattered. She flipped to a fresh page, took a deep breath and wrote, "Mystery Man. Who is he?" Sophie just found her first clue. But will anyone believe her? Sophie sat at the kitchen table, staring at her notebook. The pages were filled now, names, dates, scribbled notes, questions without answers. But one thing was clear. Her father was innocent, and someone else was responsible. The problem? No one was listening. Her mother barely spoke these days, lost in a fog of stress and exhaustion. The lawyer, Mr. Reynolds, only talked about plea deals, not proving Mark's innocence. And the police? They had already made up their minds. Sophie's fingers tightened around her pen. She could see it clear as day. The mystery man outside Mr. Jennings's house. The damaged security cameras. The pattern of break-ins. She had to tell someone. And if no one would listen, she'd make them listen. The next morning, Sophie stood outside the courthouse, her stomach twisting into knots. This was it. Inside, her father's trial had already begun. The prosecution had witnesses, evidence, and confidence. But Sophie? She only had the truth. She took a deep breath and pushed through the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Rows of people sat quietly listening to the latest testimony. Sophie slipped into a seat near the back. At the front of the room, Mark sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, his face lined with exhaustion. He barely even looked like himself anymore. And then she saw the jury. They weren't just listening. They were deciding. One wrong move, one weak argument, and they'd send her father away forever. Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears. This was her last chance. She stood up. Her legs felt shaky, but she moved forward one step at a time. The courtroom door creaked as she opened it wider, stepping towards the defense lawyer's table. Mr. Reynolds looked up, startled. "Sophie," he whispered, his brows furrowing. But Sophie didn't answer. She looked straight at the judge. Her voice didn't shake when she spoke. "I need to testify." A ripple of shocked whispers spread across the courtroom. Lisa shot up from her seat. "Sophie, no." The prosecutor was already standing. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This is a child." But the judge held up his hand, silencing the room. His sharp eyes turned to Sophie, studying her, and then he nodded. "Approach the stand." Sophie's chest tightened. This was really happening. She walked forward, climbed onto the witness stand, and sat. The microphone in front of her felt too big, too heavy, but she took a breath, and she told the truth. "My dad didn't do this." Gasps, murmurs. She held her ground. "I know because I saw someone else." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly did you see?" Sophie swallowed. This was it, the moment that could change everything. She looked straight ahead, her voice steady. "I don't know his name, but I saw a man near Mr. Jennings' house the day before the attack. He was messing with something. I think it was the security camera." The courtroom shifted. People whispered. The prosecutor stiffened. The judge leaned forward, listening carefully. But Sophie wasn't done. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her notebook, flipping to the page filled with notes about the break-ins. She held it up for everyone to see. "There have been other break-ins. They all have one thing in common: damaged cameras. If you check the old cases, I bet you'll find out that the same person is behind all of them. But it's not my dad." Silence. No one spoke. No one even moved. And then the judge turned to the prosecutor. "I want to hear more about these other break-ins." Sophie exhaled sharply, her whole body trembling. She had done it. She had changed something. The trial wasn't over yet, but for the first time, neither was her father's hope. Sophie's words just changed everything, but what happens next is even bigger. The courtroom had changed. Before Sophie spoke, it had been like a ticking clock, counting down to her father's fate. Now it was different. There was tension, uncertainty. The judge had ordered a review of the break-ins. The prosecutor, who had been so confident before, now sat stiffly in his chair, flipping through papers, avoiding eye contact. Something had shifted, but it still wasn't enough. Sophie knew she had to find more. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, her notebook spread open, pages covered in scribbles. She traced her finger over the words she had written. Mystery man, who is he? She had seen him. She knew that. And if she had seen him once, maybe she could see him again. She pulled out her mum's laptop and started searching. Glendale security camera repairs, local electricians, home repair services. Nothing. She tried something else. Home security companies, Glendale camera installations, service logs. A few links popped up. One caught her eye. James Security Solutions, serving Glendale for 15 years. A small company, barely noticeable. She clicked on it, and there on the website was a picture, a photo of a man. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. It was him. The man she had seen by Mr. Jennings's house. Her heart pounded. She clicked on the About Us section, scanning for a name. Ray Thompson, lead technician. Sophie grabbed her notebook, flipping to a new page. She wrote the name down, her hands shaking. Ray Thompson, he was there. But why? And more importantly, where was he now? The next morning, Sophie sat across from Mr. Reynolds, her father's lawyer, in his office. Stacks of papers covered his desk, but he barely glanced at her. Sophie, he sighed, rubbing his temples. I told you the case is complicated. The court can't just take a kid's notes as evidence. Sophie clenched her fists. But it's not just notes. This man, Ray Thompson, he was near Mr. Jennings's house. He works with security cameras. What if he was involved in the break-ins? Mr. Reynolds let out a slow breath, glancing at the papers in front of him. For the first time, he hesitated. You said he was near the back fence. Sophie nodded quickly. He pulled out a police report, flipping through the pages. His eyes narrowed. The back door had been tampered with before the attack. Sophie leaned forward. And my dad's wallet? What if it was planted? Ray Thompson had access to security systems. What if he wiped the footage? Mr. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He studied her, as if seeing her in a new light. Then he reached for his phone. I'm going to make a call. Sophie held her breath. Maybe, just maybe, someone was finally listening. Hours later, the police knocked on their door. Lisa answered, her face pale. The officer looked at Sophie. We need you to come down to the station. Sophie's stomach twisted. Why? The officer hesitated. Then, because we think you might be right. Sophie found the missing piece, but she's about to uncover something even more dangerous. Sophie sat in the police station, her notebook resting on her lap. She had spent weeks searching for answers. Now the police were listening. A detective, Officer Harris, sat across from her, flipping through a report. His sharp eyes scanned the pages, but his face gave nothing away. Finally, he looked up. Sophie, what made you think Ray Thompson was involved? Sophie's hands gripped the edges of her notebook. I saw him. The day before the attack, he was near Mr. Jennings' house, messing with something by the back fence. Harris tapped his fingers on the desk. And you believe he could have tampered with the security cameras? Sophie nodded quickly. I checked. His company installs security systems. He had access. And if there have been other break-ins with damaged cameras, maybe. Harris raised a hand, stopping her. His expression had changed. Not disbelief. Concern. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Sophie, Ray Thompson isn't just a security technician. He's got a criminal record. Petty theft, breaking and entering. And 3 years ago, he was suspected in a burglary where security footage mysteriously disappeared, but we could never prove it. Sophie's stomach dropped. She had been right. But Harris wasn't done. We sent a unit to question him this morning. His house was empty. His car is gone. A chill crawled up Sophie's spine. He ran? Harris nodded. And that makes him even more suspicious. Sophie's pulse pounded. If Ray Thompson had nothing to hide, why would he run? Unless he knew the truth was catching up to him. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Her father was still in jail. Ray Thompson was on the run. And the real question, the one no one was asking, was why? Was he running because he had attacked Mr. Jennings? Or was there something even bigger? She turned onto her side, pulling her blanket up to her chin. The house was silent, the kind of silence that made her feel too aware of everything. The creak of the pipes, the soft ticking of the clock, and then a noise outside. Her breath caught. It was faint, a shuffle, a soft scrape against the pavement. Slowly, she sat up. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her curtain and pulled it aside. The street outside was empty, but something felt off. She squinted at the house across the street. A dark shape stood near the corner, just barely visible in the dim glow of the street lamp. A man. Sophie's heart slammed against her ribs. She couldn't see his face, couldn't tell if he was looking at her. But she knew. Somehow she just knew. She let the curtain drop back into place, her breath shaky. Then she grabbed her notebook, and on a fresh page, she wrote 3 words. Someone is watching. Sophie is getting closer to the truth, but now the truth is watching her. Sophie barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadow outside her window, the way he stood there, watching. Was it Ray Thompson or someone else? Either way, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't safe anymore. The next morning, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, flipping through her notebook. She had pieces of the puzzle, the break-ins, the damaged cameras, Ray Thompson, but something was still missing. Something that would prove her father's innocence for good. And then she remembered. Mr. Jennings. He was still in the hospital, still recovering. What if he knew something? Lisa didn't want her to go. You don't need to be involved in this anymore, Sophie, her mother said, rubbing her temples. The police are handling it. But Sophie couldn't sit back. Not now. So, after school, she rode her bike to the hospital. The halls smelled like antiseptic. The soft beep of heart monitors echoed from the rooms. She found Mr. Jennings in room 214. His head was bandaged, his arm in a sling. He looked smaller than before, like the attack had stolen something from him. He frowned when he saw her. "Sophie, what are you doing here?" She swallowed her nerves. "I need to ask you something." He sighed, shifting in bed. "I already told the police everything I know." "But did you?" she pressed. "Because something doesn't add up." He hesitated, and that was all Sophie needed. She stepped closer. "Do you remember anything from that night?" she asked. "Anything at all?" Mr. Jennings rubbed his forehead. "It's blurry," he admitted. "I was coming home late. I opened the door, and then—" He stopped. His brows furrowed. "What?" Sophie leaned in. "What is it?" Mr. Jennings shook his head, like he was trying to clear a fog from his mind. "I heard something," he said slowly, "before I was attacked." Sophie's pulse quickened. "A voice?" she asked. He frowned. "No, a sound, like metal scraping against metal. A click." Sophie froze. "A lock." Her mind raced. "Mr. Jennings," she said carefully, "do you have a safe?" His expression shifted. "Yes, in my study. Why?" A chill ran down Sophie's spine. Was it broken into? Mr. Jennings went pale. I don't know. I never checked." Sophie's hands tightened into fists. That was it. The missing piece. Whoever attacked Mr. Jennings, it wasn't just about a random break-in. They were after something specific. Something locked away. Something still inside that safe. That night, Sophie sat at her desk, staring at her notes. She had to get into that safe. She had to know what was inside. Because whatever it was the reason her father was in jail. And maybe it was the reason Ray Thompson had disappeared. The truth is locked away, but once Sophie opens it, there's no turning back. The safe. Everything came back to it. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside was the reason her father was in jail. And the reason Ray Thompson had vanished. But how was she supposed to get to it? Mr. Jennings was still in the hospital. The police weren't looking into the safe. If she wanted answers, she had to find a way in herself. And there was only one person who could help. Sophie sat at her desk, gripping her phone, staring at the name on the screen. Mason. Her uncle, her father's younger brother, a locksmith. They weren't close. Her mum didn't like him much, said he was reckless, unreliable. But right now, she didn't have a choice. She took a deep breath and hit call. An hour later, Sophie waited outside Mr. Jennings's house, the sun setting behind her. A car pulled up. Mason stepped out, leather jacket, scruffy beard, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. He whistled when he saw her. "Didn't expect a call from you, kid." Sophie crossed her arms. "I need your help." Mason raised an eyebrow. "With what?" She hesitated. "If I tell you, do you promise not to tell Mum?" A slow smirk spread across his face. This just got interesting. 5 minutes later, Mason stood in front of the safe, running his fingers over the metal. Sophie fidgeted behind him. Every second they were inside felt like stealing time. Mason exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "This is an older model," he muttered. "Not too hard." Sophie's heart pounded. Mason pulled out his tools. A few turns, a few clicks, then a final twist. The door swung open, and inside, Sophie saw the truth. A thick envelope, a gun, and a ledger. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the ledger, flipping it open. Pages of numbers, names, transactions. Then one name stood out. Ray Thompson. Her breath caught. Mason peered over her shoulder. "What the hell is this?" Sophie shook her head. She didn't have the full picture yet. But she knew one thing. Ray Thompson wasn't just a random thief. He was involved in something much bigger. And now she had proof. Then, a noise outside. Sophie froze. Mason's head snapped up. The front door creaked. Footsteps. Someone was here. A shadow moved across the window. And then, a voice. "Step away from the safe." Sophie's blood turned to ice. She turned slowly, and standing in the doorway was Ray Thompson. Sophie has the truth, but now the truth has found her. Ray Thompson stood in the doorway. His eyes were dark, calculating. He wasn't just some runaway criminal. He was here for the ledger, for the proof Sophie had just found. Her hands tightened around the pages. Mason stepped forward, shielding Sophie slightly. "Easy, man," Mason said, his voice calm but firm. "Nobody needs to get hurt." Ray smirked. "That depends," he said. Then he pulled a gun. Sophie's breath caught. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had been chasing the truth for so long, but now the truth had chased her back. Ray took a slow step forward, the barrel of the gun steady in his grip. "You don't understand what you're holding, kid." Sophie swallowed hard. "I understand enough," she said, gripping the ledger. Ray tilted his head. "Yeah? Then you know I can't let you leave with it." Mason clenched his jaw. "Kid, when I say run, you." Sophie didn't get to hear the rest. Because in that instant, the front door burst open. "Drop the weapon." Flashlights cut through the darkness. Police officers swarmed the room. Ray's expression twisted into rage as he turned toward them, but Mason moved first. He lunged. A struggle. A gunshot rang out. Sophie screamed. Then Ray hit the ground. Silence. For a split second, no one moved. Then none of the officers rushed forward, kicking the gun aside. Ray groaned, clutching his wounded arm. "You're under arrest," an officer snapped. Sophie's chest heaved. It was over. Mason turned to her, his breathing ragged. "You okay, kid?" Sophie couldn't speak. She just nodded. Her hands shook, but she held onto the ledger. Because after everything, this was the proof that would set her father free. The truth is finally out, but will it be enough? The courtroom was silent, not the heavy silence of defeat, but the kind that came before everything changed. Sophie sat in the witness stand, her hands gripping the ledger, the proof she had risked everything to find. Across the room, her father, Mark, sat at the defense table. He looked different today. For the first time in weeks, there was something in his eyes besides exhaustion, hope. The defense lawyer, Mr. Reynolds, stepped forward. "Sophie," he said, his voice steady, "can you tell the court what you found?" Sophie took a deep breath. Then she spoke. "I found a ledger hidden in Mr. Jennings' safe. It has records of stolen money, and one of the names in it is Ray Thompson." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor stood quickly. "Objection. This is—" But Mr. Reynolds cut him off. "This ledger proves that Ray Thompson was part of a crime ring," he said, his voice unwavering, "and that Mr. Jennings had business dealings with him." The judge raised an eyebrow. The courtroom shifted. This wasn't just a break-in anymore. This was about corruption, stolen money, and a cover-up, and Sophie had exposed it. The prosecutor scrambled for control. "Sophie, you're just a child," he said, his tone sharp. "How do you know what this means?" Sophie didn't hesitate. "Because I listened," she said. "I looked where no one else would." Her voice was stronger now. "I saw Ray Thompson near Mr. Jennings's house before the attack. He was near the back fence. He knew where the cameras were. He was the one who broke in, not my dad." A murmur ran through the crowd. The judge leaned forward. The tension was electric. Then, the judge turned to the prosecution, and his next words changed everything. "This court finds the case against Mark dismissed." Lisa broke into sobs. Mark froze like he didn't dare believe it. And then, he turned to Sophie, and she ran into his arms. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't care, because it was over. Her father was free, and she had done it. One girl, one voice, one truth that changed everything. The first night her father was home, Sophie barely slept. Not because of fear, not because of nightmares, but because she was afraid that if she closed her eyes, she'd wake up and it would all be gone. The house felt different now. The weight that had been pressing down on them for weeks was finally lifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, laughter filled the kitchen again. Lisa cooked breakfast while Mark stood at the stove, flipping pancakes just like he used to. He turned to Sophie, smiling. "Extra crispy, just the way you like them." Sophie grinned. It felt good to be a family again. At school, things were different too. People whispered, but this time it wasn't out of judgment. It was out of shock. Because Sophie, the quiet girl they once ignored, had proven them all wrong. She wasn't just the daughter of a man they called a criminal. She was the girl who spoke the truth, and the truth had won. That night, Sophie sat in her room, flipping through her notebook. So many pages filled with questions, clues, suspicions, all of it leading to this moment. She picked up a pen, flipped to the last page and wrote, "One voice can change everything." She stared at the words for a long time. Then she closed the notebook. And for the first time in weeks, she finally felt at peace. No matter how small your voice is, the truth is always worth fighting for. Sophie's story proves that one voice can change everything. But how far would you go for the truth? Let us know in the comments, what would you have done in her place? If you love this story, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to this channel for more thrilling, emotional and inspiring stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next powerful story.